On the afternoon of my husband's funeral, his mother called me and told me to step back. Those were her precise words. "June, the family will be handling the estate from here. You should step back and let the Whitmores take care of Whitmore matters." 4 hours after we had buried Franklin, I was still in my coat. The house still smelled of the lilies someone had carried in from the church, and the floor polish Estelle had always insisted on when she visited. And underneath both of those things, the particular heaviness of a November afternoon in Charlotte, when the last dogwood leaves are giving up. The air goes still and cold. It smells of turned earth. Something ending. I stood in my kitchen, the same kitchen I had been sent to eat in 3 years earlier, with the children, because the adult table was full, and I held the phone and I said, very calmly, "Thank you for calling, Estelle." Then I set the phone on the counter and I called my husband's estate attorney. 6 weeks later, in a quiet office in uptown Charlotte that smelled of paper and leather, the attorney read the will aloud. The third paragraph was the residual clause. Estelle sat at the head of the table the way she had always sat at the head of every table, and Randolph sat beside her with his own attorney and a legal pad and a pen already uncapped, and I sat across from them both with my reading glasses on their chain, waiting. The estate totaled $3.6 million, all of it directed to me. I had known since the day Franklin signed it. I had driven him to the attorney's office myself. I had waited in the car. It was only fitting, I thought, that I was sitting in the right room when the numbers finally settled. Good day, dear listeners. It's Lena again, and I'm so glad you're here with me today. Before we begin, please take a moment to subscribe to the channel and tap the like button. It helps these stories reach the people who need them. And tell me in the comments which city you're listening from. I love seeing just how far these stories travel. People always say that time is what softens these things, that family hierarchies loosen, that patience is its own reward, and people come around eventually. And if you wait long enough, the slights dissolve and the table gets rearranged and suddenly there is a seat for everyone. I spent 25 years watching that theory fail. Perhaps you have too. Not in a loud way, not visibly, not with any single dramatic incident you could point to and say, "There, that was it." It failed the way a balance sheet fails when the entries are consistently wrong. Slowly, line by line, until you cannot pretend the numbers add up anymore. What I learned instead is something much simpler. The people who decide where you sit almost never think to ask whose name is on the accounts. They are too certain of the answer to check. That certainty is not a strength. It is a very specific kind of carelessness. And in the end, it cost the Whitmore family $3.6 million they had already spent in their minds. Have you ever been in a room for 20 years and still felt like a visitor? Have you ever known exactly what something was worth and said nothing simply because no one thought to ask? I had. For a long time, I had. Franklin and I met when I was 31 and he was 35. He was evaluating a franchise acquisition, and I kept the books at the firm that was advising him. At our third meeting, a Thursday morning in October, the autumn of 1999, he said that I was the only person in the room who had actually read the full balance sheet. He said it the way someone says something true rather than something flattering, which is how I knew he meant it. We were married 6 months later in a small ceremony at a courthouse in South Charlotte, because Franklin said large gatherings made him feel like a performance rather than a person. The Whitmore family received this information and began, quietly and systematically, treating me as a temporary arrangement. Estelle called me Franklin's wife every time she introduced me to anyone, for the full 25 years of our marriage, in a tone that suggested the arrangement might still be pending review. She was not physically unkind. She was procedurally unkind, which is a different thing entirely and considerably harder to document. She did not raise her voice. She did not say anything you could repeat to someone else and have them understand exactly why it landed the way it did. She simply made certain, in every setting that counted, that I remained peripheral. At family gatherings in the Myers Park house, the large brick colonial where she had lived for 50 years, I was introduced by relation rather than by name. Relatives I had known for a decade still called me Franklin's wife. Estelle had never corrected them. I had never pressed the point. I had a name. June, 4 letters, easy to say. Apparently impossible to use. The Myers Park house had a kitchen I came to know very well. Not always, not every time, but often enough that it felt like a settled arrangement. I learned which cabinet held the extra serving spoons. The refrigerator door swelled shut in humid weather. It needed a firm second pull. I knew the smell of that kitchen in the morning. Coffee, old wood, the faint sweetness of whatever Estelle had baked the day before. I knew that kitchen the way you know a room you spent time in without choosing to. In those first years of our marriage, when I was still learning the Whitmore territory, I made efforts. I brought food to gatherings. I helped clear the table. I asked questions of the older relatives, Franklin's aunts and cousins, people with long memories. One of Estelle's sisters, a woman named Henrietta, who had lived in Asheville her whole life, told me once at a Thanksgiving that I had lovely manners and that it was a shame the family didn't see more of me. I thanked her and understood, from the way she said it, that Henrietta had noticed the same thing I had. I stopped making efforts sometime around the 7th year. Not bitterly, not in a spirit of defeat. Simply because it had become clear that the geography of the Whitmore family gatherings had been decided before I arrived and was not subject to revision. The formal dining room was the formal dining room. The seat at the back of the church was the seat at the back of the church. The introduction as Franklin's wife was the introduction as Franklin's wife. These were the fixed points. I was the variable. Franklin knew. He never said so directly. But you know how some silences carry more information than words? He was not a man who performed awareness of painful things. But there were moments, a look across a dinner table, a hand briefly covering mine in the car on the drive home from Myers Park. Those moments told me he saw it clearly, that he was sorry for it, that he did not know how to change it without a confrontation that would cost him something he was not ready to spend. I did not ask him to spend it. That was my choice, made consciously and kept. The first Whitmore Christmas I attended was in 2001, 2 years into the marriage. The house in Myers Park was decorated in the way that only a Southern family matriarch of long standing decorates for Christmas. Every surface dressed, every candle holder filled, a tree in the formal parlor trimmed by the same people, in the same way, for 30 years. There were 17 people at dinner that evening. I helped carry dishes from the kitchen. I refilled water glasses and cleared plates and listened to a great deal of conversation about people I did not know and events I had not been present for. Estelle gave a brief toast before the meal. She thanked each person at the table by name. She did not use mine. I counted afterward, not out of self-pity, I want to be clear about that. out of the same reflex that makes a bookkeeper reach for a pencil when someone quotes a figure without documentation. 12 adults at that table, plus Franklin. 11 names in Estelle's toast. 1 omission. The math was simple. Do the math yourself if you don't believe me. 11 names. 12 adults. 1 omission. You would have noticed too. Franklin squeezed my hand under the table. He had heard it too. I decided that evening that I would not spend my marriage being hurt by a woman who had decided not to know me. I would simply do what I always did, the work in front of me. Carefully and completely. The hurt was real. I am not pretending otherwise. You should know that. But I had been a bookkeeper for long enough to know that feelings not useful to the task at hand should be set aside until the task is finished. The task was the marriage. The marriage was Franklin. I kept doing the work. That is all. There is nothing else to say. In July of 2019, the Whitmores held a family reunion at the Myers Park house. 60 or 70 people, a Saturday afternoon, the backyard tables covered in that specific southern summer heat that makes everything feel slightly overripe. The formal dining room was arranged for the senior Whitmore relatives, Estelle, her sisters, the older cousins who had come in from out of state. The table was full. I arrived with Franklin, who was already moving more slowly by then. Corinne was near the door, Randolph's wife, a woman who had mastered the social geometry of the Whitmore family in a way I had consciously refused to. She looked at me and said something cheerful. The way you say something cheerful precisely because you know it isn't. Have you ever had someone say something to you that way, with that particular bright smile? June, why don't you eat with the children in the kitchen? There's just not quite enough room at the table today. I looked at her for a moment. She held my gaze without blinking, which told me she had prepared the sentence in advance. I went to the kitchen. I sat down. The grandchildren were eating paper plates of potato salad. I ate my own lunch. I smiled at the children. I did not say a word about it to anyone except Franklin that evening. He held my hand and said he was sorry. I told him he had nothing to apologize for. He apologized anyway, quietly, looking at the window rather than at me. I understood that the apology was also for the 7 years before it and the years before those. For all the seats he had not been able to give me, for all the introductions that had never included my name. There is a chair in that kitchen, a wooden ladder-back chair with a slightly uneven leg that rocked when you shifted your weight. I sat in it that afternoon with a plate of food I had helped prepare. Children surrounded me, too young to understand the geometry of what had just happened. I ate my lunch. I thought about what it means to be in a room for 20 years and still be told, cheerfully, that you have been assigned a different table. Have you ever been told that? In those exact words or others? I thought about that chair for a long time afterward. There was a particular moment from that afternoon that I have turned over in my mind many times since. One of the Whitmore grandchildren looked up at me from his paper plate, Randolph's youngest grandson, about 8 years old. He said, very directly, the way children are direct, "Why are you eating in here?" I told him that there wasn't quite enough room at the big table. He thought about this for a moment and then offered me half of his bread roll, because to an 8-year-old, the appropriate response to unfairness is to share what you have. I thanked him. I took the bread. It was the kindest gesture anyone in that house had ever extended to me, and it came from a child who would not remember it by the following summer. I remembered it. I wrote it down that evening in the back of the notebook I kept on my kitchen desk, in the section I used for observations that did not belong anywhere else. In the last 8 years of Franklin's life, his health declined in stages. Not suddenly, not dramatically. The way a tide goes out, gradually, then noticeably, then undeniable. He had been a vigorous man, broad-shouldered, someone who had walked the 3 storage facility locations personally every month for 15 years. He shook hands with the managers, checked the loading docks, reviewed the quarterly numbers with the kind of tactile engagement that comes from having built something from nothing. The adjustment to diminished capacity was not easy for him. He managed it with the same dry practicality he brought to everything else, making decisions before they became necessary. Closing off dependencies. Putting things in order the way you close up a house before a long winter. He needed help with the financial administration of the storage franchise locations, not because there was no one else. Because Franklin had spent 15 years watching me balance ledgers at the kitchen table. He understood what careful attention to numbers actually looks like. He knew who in his life had it. He asked me to manage all of it. I took the task the same way I had taken every task in our marriage, without ceremony, with accuracy. I managed the payroll for 31 employees across 3 locations for 6 years. I filed the quarterly franchise taxes. I reconciled the vendor accounts. I maintained the ledger books that tracked every transaction across the full operating period. When Franklin decided to sell the franchise locations, I supervised the process. I coordinated with the buyer, reviewed the transfer documents, confirmed the closing figures, made sure the payments cleared. All of it. The 3 sales closed in sequence over 14 months. The final one closed 3 months before Franklin died. The combined proceeds, $2.1 million, went into a joint account that Franklin and I had held together for 11 years. We had opened it for the household renovation in 2012. New kitchen cabinets. A new back porch. Franklin had said we should do the thing properly if we were doing it at all. Franklin's family knew he had franchise locations. They knew, in a general way, that there had been some kind of sale process. Randolph had asked Franklin once at a family dinner whether the storage business was winding down. Franklin had said yes, it was being handled. Randolph had nodded and turned back to his food. The specifics had not been a subject of further inquiry, because the specifics were details. And the details had always seemed like someone else's department. My reading glasses lived on a chain around my neck because I was always reaching for a document. That had been true since my early 40s, when I first started needing them, and it had become so habitual that I forgot they were there most of the time. The chain was a simple silver one Franklin had bought at a hardware store the winter I kept setting the glasses down and losing them on the desk. He attached a small clasp, handed it to me without comment. It cost $4.50. I wore it every day afterward. The way you wear things that have become part of how you move through the world. The glasses were on that chain the morning I drove Franklin to Hartwell Osai's office on a Tuesday in February, 8 months before Franklin died. I remember the morning clearly. It was cold for Charlotte, a thin gray cold that made the bare trees along the highway look like something sketched rather than grown. Franklin was wearing his good overcoat, the dark wool one he saved for occasions that required an appearance of authority. He sat in the passenger seat with his hands in his lap and looked out the window for most of the drive without saying much. He told me, as we turned onto the street where Hartwell's building was, that he had revised the will. He told me what the revision said. He told me about the explanatory sentence he had asked Hartwell to include in the preamble, because Franklin had wanted it understood that his intentions were not impulsive. He said these things without ceremony, the way he said most important things, directly, simply, in a tone that expected me to absorb the information and not make a production of it. I absorbed it. I did not make a production of it. That was the right response. That had always been the right response. You learn that. Eventually, I waited in the car while he went inside and signed. I sat in the parking structure for 45 minutes. I had brought a magazine, the kind you bring to waiting rooms. When Franklin came back out and got back into the passenger seat, he looked lighter than he had going in. The particular lightness of someone who has finished something they had been carrying for a long time. I did not ask how it had gone. He buckled his seatbelt and said, "It's done." I said, "All right." And we drove to the diner on Providence Road, and Franklin ordered a piece of coconut cream pie, which he was not supposed to have, and I did not say anything about it because it was a Tuesday and he had just signed something that had taken courage, and some moments require pie rather than discipline. He died 8 months later, on a Wednesday morning in October, with the light coming through the bedroom curtains the way it does in autumn in Charlotte, flat and gold and a little tired, the light of a season finishing its work. I sat beside him for a while after. Then I called the doctor. Then I called Franklin's sister. Then I drove to the hospital to handle the paperwork. At some point during that long day, I took my reading glasses off their chain and set them on the nightstand. I sat very still in the kitchen for perhaps 20 minutes. I needed that time. Perhaps you would have needed it too. Then I was ready. I made the next call. I called Hartwell from the hospital that evening. The first sign that the family intended to move quickly came the week after the funeral. Randolph left a voicemail on Franklin's old office line, the administrative number for the storage facility company, which had been forwarded to my cell since the first franchise sale, because I had been the one monitoring it for 6 years. Randolph had called the business attorney, not Hartwell, and left a message asking about the timing on the asset review. His tone was businesslike, the tone of a man who had already constructed the sequence of events in his head and was beginning to move through it. He did not say anything explicit. He did not need to. Implicit was sufficient. He did not know I was the one monitoring that line. I noted the call in the margin of the ledger page I was working on. The date. The time. The phrase timing on the asset review in quotation marks. The way I had always noted anything that might matter later. The ledger was open on the kitchen table. I set down my pen and listened to the voicemail twice, and then I went back to the numbers. 3 weeks after the funeral, a second thing arrived. A letter addressed to me as surviving spouse of Franklin Whitmore from a Charlotte law firm I did not recognize. 2 paragraphs long. The first established that the firm understood I was navigating a complex estate process and that independent legal guidance could help. The second offered the firm's services. Nothing in it was improper. Nothing was explicit. But the letter had been sent by someone with a specific reason for sending it, and the question of who had that reason had a very clear answer. Do you know what it tells you when a letter like that arrives before the will has even been read? It tells you that someone has already decided what the outcome should be, that someone has done the calculation and concluded that a woman who ate in the kitchen for 25 years might, with the right approach, be persuaded to step back one more time. Someone had suggested to Randolph's attorney that I might be navigable. That presented with enough apparent consideration. The surviving spouse of Franklin Whitmore might sign something that was not in her interest. I kept the letter in a cream-colored folder. On my kitchen desk, I kept the voicemail recording. On my phone, both of them, I did not mention either of them to Hartwell yet. Not yet. There was a time for that. It had not arrived. In the evenings during those weeks, I sat at my kitchen table with my reading glasses on. I went through the ledger books. All 8 years of them. Every franchise payroll. Every quarterly filing. Every asset transfer from the 3 storage facility sales. Documented in the careful handwriting I had developed over 30 years of bookkeeping. The work had been mine. The accuracy had been mine. The decisions that had protected those accounts and closed those sales cleanly had been mine. Franklin had known it. He had known it the day he asked me to drive him to Hartwell's office. There is a particular quality to the calm that settles over you when you are the only person in the room who has read the whole document. It is not arrogance. It is not anticipation of victory. It is something quieter than either of those things, the unhurried certainty of someone who has done the arithmetic already and has nothing left to calculate. I had that feeling every evening at that table, with the ledger books open and the chain of reading glasses against my collarbone, and the November dark coming in early through the kitchen window. I was not afraid of what was coming. I was simply waiting for it to arrive. Hartwell and I had spoken twice in the weeks immediately after the funeral. The first call was practical. He had advised me to make no financial decisions until the formal reading had taken place and the estate transfer had been initiated. He mentioned that the family might attempt to contact me about the estate, and that if they did, I should note the contact but say nothing substantive. I told him I had already noted 2 contacts and would send him documentation. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "How long have you been monitoring the office line?" I told him 6 years, since the first franchise sale. Another pause. Then, I see. The second call had been a brief confirmation that the formal notification would be scheduled within the week. He asked whether I was managing. I said I was. He said he would be in touch, and he was. Hartwell called me 6 weeks after the funeral to schedule a private notification meeting before the formal family reading. He explained the procedure in his careful, measured way. The estate process required that I, as the named beneficiary, be informed in advance, before the family was gathered. He walked me through the administrative sequence with the patience of someone who understood that precision mattered and that people under stress could not always hold procedural information the first time through. Then, he confirmed the contents of the will. He read me the preamble, including the sentence Franklin had asked to have included. My wife June has managed our affairs with complete competence and complete loyalty, and this estate reflects my gratitude. Franklin's voice in that sentence was unmistakable. His cadence, his precision, his absolute refusal to dress a statement in anything except its own meaning. I had to set my coffee down for a moment. Not because I was surprised. I had known what was in the document since February, since the parking structure outside Hartwell's building. But because hearing it read aloud by someone else made it concrete in a different way. Franklin had written those words. He had chosen them. He had asked for them to be said in a room full of people after he was gone. And I would be the one sitting in the room when they were. Hartwell then walked me through the numbers. The storage facility sale proceeds, $2.1 million, had already passed to me by right of survivorship when the joint account transferred at death. The remaining estate brought the total distributable value to $3.6 million, all of it directed to me outright. Randolph had been listed in the previous will for $400,000, two other siblings for $75,000 each. All specific bequests to Franklin's siblings had been removed. I thanked Hartwell. He said he would see me at the formal reading. He sent a cream-colored legal envelope to my address by courier the following morning. I set it on my kitchen table when it arrived. I left it there for 3 days, in the center of the table where I had eaten most of my lunches for the past 8 years, and I looked at it each morning over my coffee. I did not open it. I already knew what it said. The envelope sat on the table like a kind of conclusion, the last document of a very long process of entries and reconciliations and careful, unglamorous work. Looking at it felt like closing the ledger at the end of a quarter, the numbers exactly right. The formal reading was scheduled for a Thursday morning. I drove uptown in the early dark of a November morning, parked the car in the structure on Tryon Street, and walked the 3 blocks to Hartwell's building with my coat buttoned and my glasses on their chain. The air smelled of cold pavement and coffee from a cart on the corner. It was 6:52 in the morning, and the city was still mostly quiet. I went up in the elevator to the 14th floor and sat in the waiting area of Hartwell's suite for 12 minutes before anyone else arrived. The receptionist brought me a cup of coffee. I thanked her and held the cup in both hands and looked at the framed diplomas on the wall and felt nothing in particular, which was not emptiness. It was resolution. There is a difference. Estelle arrived with Randolph and Corinne and the attorney. Estelle wore a gray wool suit. She arranged herself at the table in the way she always arranged herself, not at the technical head, which was Hartwell's end, but at the lateral position that functioned, in any room she occupied, as the operative center of authority. She did not greet me. She nodded. I nodded back. Randolph sat beside her. He was 61 years old, Franklin's younger brother by 4 years. A man who had spent his adult life adjacent to Franklin's success without building anything equivalent. He had, as Hartwell noted, already retained an attorney weeks before the formal reading. The attorney, younger than Randolph, well-dressed, with a legal pad in front of him and the posture of professional readiness, had, as I would learn later, been on retainer since the week after the funeral. Corinne sat beside Randolph. She was the kind of woman who always knew where to position herself in relation to a conversation, close enough to participate, far enough to observe. She had positioned herself that morning in an attitude of confident support. She would shift. I noted the starting position. Hartwell opened the reading at 9 o'clock. He explained the procedure in his customary, thorough way. Certified copies prepared for all parties. The reading would proceed in full. Questions would be addressed after the complete instrument had been read. He began with the formal identification of the instrument. The date of execution. Franklin's full legal name. The names of the witnesses. The firm's address. Standard language. The language of legal documents that has been refined over centuries to say exactly what it says and nothing more, and in that precision to carry the full weight of whatever follows. Then he read the preamble. Randolph's attorney was writing on his legal pad before the preamble was finished. I saw the pen moving. I did not try to read what he wrote. It did not matter. What would you have written in his position? Whatever it was, the document in front of him had already made it irrelevant. What mattered was Estelle's face while Hartwell read Franklin's sentence. The sentence about my management, about his gratitude. Her expression did not collapse or crumple or show anything so legible as surprise. It did something more subtle. The absolute certainty that usually organized her features, the settled composure of a woman who had run the social architecture of her family for 50 years, that certainty went somewhere. Not gone, just absent. Briefly, like a room where the furniture is the same but the light has changed. She did not look at me. She looked at Hartwell. Hartwell moved through the first paragraph. The second. The third paragraph was the residual clause. He read it at the same pace he had used for the paragraphs before it. That was its own kind of precision, the refusal to emphasize, the flat accuracy of a man reading a legal instrument, which gave the words no drama, but gave them everything they had earned on their own. The residual estate. All remaining assets. Directed in its entirety to June Ann Whitmore, surviving spouse. $3.6 million. The room was quiet. The specific quality of that quiet I have tried since to find the right words. It was the quiet of something settled, a column of numbers that had been, finally and irrevocably, added up. There was no negotiating with it. No narrative could accommodate it except the one sitting in the room in front of them, in the form of a woman in navy blue, reading glasses on a silver chain. Randolph turned to his attorney. His attorney looked at the certified copy that had been set in front of him and then at the table. And Estelle turned to Hartwell. She asked, in a voice I had never heard from her before, a voice that was the shape of her usual authority without the substance of it. The way a mold holds the form of something after the original material has been removed. Is this the current will? Hartwell said yes, simply and completely yes. It was, and completely yes. No elaboration, no softening, no procedural explanation. The question had a factual answer, and he gave it. She did not speak again. I reached up and put on my reading glasses. They had been resting on their chain against my collarbone the entire morning, as they always rested when I was not reading, and I asked Hartwell to confirm the transfer timeline. He said 4 to 6 weeks. I thanked him. I wrote nothing on a legal pad. The numbers were what they were. Randolph looked at his attorney. Corinne's expression had moved through several phases during the reading. It had arrived somewhere without a comfortable name. A recognition, I thought, that things she had believed to be fixed were not fixed at all. That cheerful sentences about kitchen chairs and adult tables had a longer life than she had anticipated. We finished in 40 minutes. I collected my certified copy, thanked Hartwell, thanked his assistant. Left, I took the elevator down alone. I walked the 3 blocks back to the parking structure in the November morning, in the same cold pavement smell and the same thin coffee smell from the corner cart, and I got in my car. Sat for a moment. Then started the engine. I did not feel triumph. I want to be precise about this. What I felt was simpler than triumph and, in some ways, quieter. It was the feeling of a door closing on a room that had needed closing for a long time. The letter from Randolph's attorney arrived 12 days after the formal reading. It suggested the possibility of undue influence. The argument, as Hartwell summarized it for me, was that Franklin's health in his final year had made him susceptible to influence from someone in close proximity, meaning me, and that the will revision, occurring 8 months before his death, warranted scrutiny. I asked Hartwell what this meant in practical terms. He said he would handle it, and he explained how. Franklin's final cognitive assessment had been conducted 14 days before the will signing. A full evaluation ordered by his neurologist as part of ongoing care management, covering memory, orientation, executive function, and decision-making capacity. The results showed no impairment. The assessment had been conducted by a physician at a Charlotte hospital, documented in a formal report, and filed with Franklin's medical records. Hartwell had obtained a copy at the time of the signing, because he was the kind of attorney who anticipated the questions that arise when a will revision occurs close to a death, and who prepares for those questions before they are asked. He also had the sworn statements of both witnesses present at the signing, 2 members of his own firm, attesting to Franklin's demeanor, his clarity of expression, and his explicit articulation of his intentions. Franklin had explained, in the presence of those witnesses, why he was making the change. He had not been confused. He had not been prompted. He had not been pressured. He had been a man putting his affairs in order, making a decision about his own estate, with full knowledge of what he was doing and full competence to do it. Hartwell sent a 4-page response to Randolph's attorney. It contained the cognitive assessment, the witness statements, a careful accounting of the execution procedure, and a thorough review of the relevant legal standard for undue influence under North Carolina law. It was precise, complete, and, I gather from Hartwell's summary, sufficient. The suggestion was withdrawn 11 days later. I did not hear about the withdrawal immediately. During those 11 days, I had been at my kitchen table, going through the final reconciliation of the storage facility records, closing out the last accounts, verifying the final figures, doing the work that needed doing. It was ordinary bookkeeping work. Numbers that behaved according to rules, that did not change to accommodate anyone's expectations, that added up to the same total whether Randolph's attorney had sent a letter or not. Hartwell called to tell me about the withdrawal on a Friday morning. I thanked him and made a note in the margin of the page I was working on. Estelle retained her own attorney approximately 3 weeks after the formal reading. A different firm, older, established, with the kind of institutional reputation that signals a client who expects to be taken seriously. That attorney reviewed the instrument, the supporting documentation, the cognitive assessment, and the execution records. The review took 10 days. At the end of it, the attorney wrote a letter to Hartwell advising that there was no viable legal challenge. I eventually saw that letter as part of the estate transfer documentation. It used the phrase unambiguous and properly executed twice in the first paragraph. The second instance was not a repetition for emphasis. It was a confirmation, the way an auditor writes a number twice when they want to be absolutely certain it has been understood. I noted both instances. Old bookkeeping habit. You count the things that matter. There were weeks during the transfer process when I sat in the probate courthouse in uptown Charlotte. On the second of those visits, I ran into the manager of the third storage facility location, a man named Marcus, who had worked for Franklin for 11 years and who had known me for most of them. He was there on an entirely separate matter, some registration issue with a vehicle title, and he was waiting in the same queue. He recognized me. He came over and asked how I was doing. I told him I was doing all right. He said that was good, And then he said, simply and without any editorial comment whatsoever, "Mr. Franklin always said you were the one who kept the whole thing running." I thanked him. He went back to his place in the queue. It was a 30-second exchange, and I thought about it for the rest of the afternoon. Marcus had sent a card after the funeral. A simple one. A few lines in his handwriting saying that Franklin had been a fair employer and that working at the third location had been the best job he had ever had. He thanked me for helping with the closing process. Said I had made a complicated thing manageable. I kept that card in the same drawer as the cream-colored folder from Hartwell, which is not where I keep most cards. It seemed to belong there, not long sessions. The transfer was procedural, a bureaucratic process conducted in a room with fluorescent lights and a numbered queue. The kind of room that exists purely to record facts that have already been established elsewhere. I sat there with my copy of the documents and my reading glasses, and I answered the questions I was asked. And I signed what I was asked to sign, and I thanked the clerk when we were done. Do you know that feeling when a very long piece of work comes finally to its completion? Not a dramatic completion, not a celebration. Just the moment when you close the file and the numbers are right and the entries balance and there is nothing left to verify. That is what the probate courthouse felt like. A room where a legal fact was being recorded. The fact was that I was the sole beneficiary of the estate of Franklin Whitmore in the amount of $3.6 million. The fact was recorded. The work was complete. I thought, sitting in that room with my glasses on their chain, about Franklin in his good overcoat on a February morning outside Hartwell's building, getting out of the car to go inside and sign something that no one in his family knew about the way he had looked when he came back, lighter, finished, a man who had resolved something that had been sitting unresolved in him for months, about the coconut cream pie he was not supposed to have, and the way he had ordered it without ceremony, with the particular freedom of a person who has done something difficult and earned the right to something sweet. I thought about that morning often in the weeks after the estate transfer completed. I want to tell you something about those 25 years, because I think it is the part of the story hardest to explain. And I want you to understand it correctly. When people hear the outcome, the will, the numbers, Estelle's voice losing its authority in Hartwell's conference room, they tend to imagine that I must have been waiting for it all along, that there was a plan, a long game, a calculation running in the background the whole time. There wasn't. There was simply work. There was the payroll and the quarterly filings and the asset transfers and the franchise sale documents and the joint account and the ledger books, all of it done with the same attention I would have brought to it, whether or not it eventually mattered in this particular way. What Franklin understood, what he had seen from the third meeting in October of 1999, was that I brought that attention to everything, always, not instrumentally but constitutively. It was not a tactic. It was simply how I worked. Perhaps you have someone like that in your life, someone who does the work without announcement, without an audience, because the work itself is the point. The will revision was his recognition of that. The estate was his record of it. It said exactly what it meant. It directed exactly what he intended. The only thing unusual about it was that the Whitmore family had spent 25 years not asking about any of it. And so when the document was read aloud in a quiet room in November, the numbers arrived as a surprise to everyone in the room, except me, and the man who had written them. The estate transferred in 5 weeks. The investment accounts were retitled. The personal accounts were transferred. The Myers Park house came into my name and sat there while I decided what to do with it. I listed it the following June. It sold in 11 days at $890,000 to a family from Atlanta who were moving to Charlotte for work. The husband was a mechanical engineer. His wife, he told the agent, loved the kitchen. I thought about that when the agent called to confirm the sale. I moved to a smaller house in a neighborhood on the other side of the city. It had a porch that faced west and caught the late afternoon light in the autumn the way a porch should, slowly, warmly, in a way that invited you to sit down and stay for a while. The neighborhood was quiet. The street had old oak trees that arched over it in summer and dropped their leaves in October in the satisfying, complete way that old trees do. The neighbors waved from driveways. Nobody called me Franklin's wife. Nobody pointed me toward a different table. I went through a period in the first spring after the move of going through Franklin's personal papers, letters he had kept, receipts from trips we had taken, a folder of photographs from before we met from his 20s that I had never seen. In the back of the folder, in an envelope I almost did not open because it had no label, I found a note he had written to himself at some point, undated, on a half sheet of the legal pad he had always kept on his desk. It said, "June knows. She always knows." That was all. No context. No explanation. Just that sentence, in his ballpoint pen, in his handwriting. I put it back in the envelope. I put the envelope in the drawer with Marcus's card and Hartwell's cream-colored folder. What do you keep after something like this? What do you take with you when you leave a house that was never entirely yours? I knew the answer without having to think about it. I kept Franklin's ledger books, all 8 years of them. They were as much mine as his. We had built them together, line by line, in the evenings at the kitchen table. My reading glasses on, his handwriting in the margins, notes, questions, occasionally a small arrow, pointing to a figure he thought deserved particular attention. I put the books on a shelf in the study in the new house. I looked at them sometimes. I thought about the particular way Franklin had of explaining a financial concept, not as a teacher to a student, as one person to another who both understood the subject. That is the best way. The rarest. I missed him. I miss him still. What I had not anticipated, in all my careful arithmetic, was how much of the daily texture of my life had been organized around his presence, not around the big things, the franchise sales and the quarterly filings and the estate documents, but around the small ones. The way he read the newspaper at the kitchen table, folded in quarters, coffee going cold. The way he identified interesting transactions by circling figures in ballpoint pen and leaving the paper open on the counter for me. He always bought the same ink pens. Fine point, navy, in a box of 12. He kept them in a holder on his desk that I have moved to my own desk in the new house, where it sits next to the ledger books. Small things. The inventory of a shared life. You do not know the full extent of that inventory until you are the only one left to take it. There were things the estate did not fix. I want to be clear about this, because I think the story is not about the money, exactly, even though the money is specific and real and mattered. I want you to understand that part. The story is about what it costs to be in a family for 25 years and be the person whose name they could not say. That cost did not go away when the numbers transferred. The empty chair at the table is still empty. The fact of 25 years of introductions that did not include my name is still a fact, the way any fact is still true after the circumstances have changed. Franklin was gone. That was the largest cost of all, and no estate total changes it. Corinne sent a Christmas card that December. It was a standard card, a winter landscape, a generic greeting inside in Corinne's handwriting, as if the morning in Hartwell's office had not happened and we were still in the territory where cheerful gestures were sufficient currency. I held it for a moment, turning it over in my hands, and then I wrote return to sender on the envelope and put it back in the mailbox. It was not anger. I want you to understand that it was not anger. It was accuracy. There was no relationship there to acknowledge with a Christmas card. There had not been one for 25 years, and the formal reading had not created one. It had simply made the absence visible. Estelle has not called since the afternoon of the funeral. I do not expect her to. What would she say? She said what she had to say in Hartwell's conference room, with her single question and then her silence. That was the full accounting. The rest is just time. Passing the kitchen chair from the Myers Park house, the ladder back one with the slightly uneven leg, the one I sat in at the 2019 reunion while the adult table was full, went with the house when it sold. I did not take it. I had no use for it. It belonged to the version of my life that had concluded on a Thursday morning in November in uptown Charlotte, in a quiet room that smelled of paper and leather, where a man read a sentence that Franklin had written about me, and a woman who had never once used my given name asked whether the document in front of her was the current will. It was. It has always been. And my name was on it from the moment Franklin signed it, in the parking structure on a Tuesday in February, with my reading glasses on their chain, waiting. Franklin used to say that the people who assign the seats almost never think about who is keeping score. He was right about most things. He was particularly right about that. To Estelle Whitmore, who called me Franklin's wife for 25 years, my name is June, and my name is on the estate. Now, dear listeners, I want to ask you something directly. Would you have waited for the formal reading, or would you have told the family sooner, before that Thursday morning, what was already settled? Leave your answer in the comments, along with the city you're listening from. And if you know someone who has ever been sent to eat in the kitchen, please share this story with them. They deserve to hear it. Thank you, always, for listening.